It is no accident that one of our college colors is green. You stop and think about it for a second. We have a forest in the front and a forest in the back of campus. We are literally bookmarked right between two forests. Hi, I'm Brad Schwamberger, graduate of the class of 1983, and I'm here today to take you on a special tour in honor of the 150th anniversary of Wilmington College. So today, we're going to talk about some of the trees, what makes them interesting, stories that ties them to Quakers, and even in one case, we're going to show you a plant that was actually kind of named after the college, that was actually discovered on college grounds. So we're going to take this trip today. We're going to learn about history, we're going to learn a little about culture, we're going to see some unusual plants. I'm going to show you the most historic tree we have on campus. I'm going to show you the oldest tree we have on campus. I'm going to show you trees that actually were alive during the time of dinosaurs. So hold on, buckle in, and have fun. First tree I'd like to talk about today is this. This is an oak tree, and this is a member of the red oak family. This one's a little unusual. The acorns are egg-shaped. That looks like an egg. So this is the Shumard oak. And out of all the oak trees, this is the Cadillac for making furniture. This is the Cadillac of white and red oaks. This makes the best furniture. Now this is, if we actually got up and looked at the tree, what's kind of neat about this tree is on the underside of the leaves, where the veins are, we'll actually see there's little hairs, little like armpit hairs right there in the veins. So that's how we can tell this is Shumard oak. Just a very short walk in the back of College Hall from our oldest tree on campus is our most historical tree on campus. This is a cutting off of Logan's elm. Now let's talk about American elms for a little bit. First thing, elms to the Europeans were planted in every spot that had a village commons or a city park. They were the trees that Europeans thought that justice should be conducted under. So if you went to trial, in most places, you sat underneath an elm tree. If you tried to sort out property disputes, land deed disputes, anything like that, you generally went to the village commons and you had a meeting underneath the elm tree. Unfortunately, the elms also were where if someone was deemed bad enough and was executed, the gallows were built under elm trees, or in some cases, a rope was thrown over a branch of an elm tree and someone was hung from the village elm tree. But elms, when you look at American history in total, elms played a very crucial part. It's said that George Washington took command of the Continental Army underneath an elm tree that's in New York. We have the famous elm tree that William Penn, our Quaker founder for the colony of Pennsylvania, conducts the first purchase of land in Pennsylvania underneath an elm tree. And this tree is a start off of Logan's elm. Now, Logan's elm is now dead, but someone took a cutting off of that and gave it to the college. Now, Quakers and Native Americans had kind of an interesting history. Native Americans learned that Quakers were not armed, so they didn't have to worry about getting stolen from, having things taken from them being killed. So Quakers could pretty much move around the frontier and not be harassed too much from the Native Americans. They also knew that if they were in dire need of food, water, shelter, medicine, that if they went to a Quaker cabin and knocked on the door, oftentimes they would be provided as much aid as the family possibly had. So it was a very important kind of relationship that they had. It was very unusual for whites to be that open with Native Americans. And part of this, the reason we have this Logan's elm cutting here is to partially honor that connection. The Quakers are also active in Native American causes today. But let's talk a little about Logan's elm. This elm, when it was alive, was 24 foot across. Stop and think about that for a minute. 24 foot. That's 6 of me stacked head for head for head for head.
and that's how big the tree was. We think that it was probably one of the largest elms in the United States, if not the largest American elm in the United States at all, anytime. This cutting is a little unique. It's multi-branched. It's not the big stately vase shape like we're used to seeing a lot of the American elms. And this is, if I suspect, never came down with Dutch elm disease because it has this interesting little characteristic, tetraploid. Now, we think of all cells having 2 strands of genetic material. This tree, I suspect, if it was tested, has 3 strands of genetic material. And before you think that's really odd, it is odd for us as animals to have more than 2 strands in our cells. But for plants, it's actually more common than what you think. If you grow daylilies, and you grow the really big flowering daylilies, those are actually tetraploid, 3 strands of genetic material, and that's what gets the flowers so big. So this tree is Logan's elm, and Logan gave an impassioned speech underneath it. But before we listen to the speech, let's talk a little about Logan himself. Logan's mother was a Seneca. So by birth, since he was Iroquois, the Iroquois always considered your bloodline to come from your mother's side, not your father's side. His mother was Seneca, he was considered Seneca. He broke away from the Iroquois and formed kind of a new band of Indians called the Mingos. They had some Delaware, they had some Shawnee, they had some other Iroquois people that were involved in this. The Mingos basically did not necessarily detest the whites. Logan was very friendly to the whites. Logan provided as much aid and as much help as he could to white settlers. He would invite them into his cabin or into his lodge. He would feed them. He would help them in any way that he could. Logan is out, away from his campment along the Ohio River. A group of trappers and frontiersmen camp across the Ohio River from his village. They lure some people over. They end up killing all of Logan's family, including his father that jumps in a canoe and tries to get across the Ohio River, and he's actually shot dead in his canoe attempting to paddle across the Ohio River. Logan comes back. Logan's devastated. His whole family, brothers, sisters, wife, father, everyone in his whole family has just been completely killed. So he's invited to a peace talk. He refuses to go. Instead, he requests 2 very famous frontiersmen, Simon Girty and Simon Kenton, to come and listen to a speech that he will give underneath Logan's elm that was just outside of present Circleville, Ohio today. So let's take a moment here and listen to Logan's speech.
I appeal to any white man to say if he ever entered Logan's cabin hungry and he gave him not meat, if he ever came cold and naked and he clothed him not. During the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin, an advocate for peace. Such was my love for the whites that my countrymen pointed as I passed and said, "Logan is a friend of the white man." I had even thought to have lived with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel Creasap. The last spring, in cold blood and unprovoked, murdered the relatives of Logan, not even sparing his wife and children. There runs not a drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature. This called on me for revenge. I have sought it. I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice in the beams of peace. But do not harbor a thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one.
Amazing. That's oftentimes referred to as Logan's Lentiment. You have to remember, this speech was so moving. This is considered one of the greatest speeches ever given by a Native American in the history of this country. It was so profound at the time that even American soldiers would actually memorize this speech. And oftentimes the campfire would repeat the end of it. You know, for who will weep for Logan, for there is no one. Sad to say, Logan dies outside of Detroit years later, and he's walking home to a cabin that Simon Gertie and Simon Kenton actually built for him outside of present-day Detroit. So this is our elm, Logan's elm. Well, we're here almost in front of Watson Library, and no tour is ever complete in the state of Ohio without showing off our marvelous Ohio buckeye tree. Buckeyes are kind of interesting. There's nuts inside this husk. Of course, the Ohio buckeye, the outside husk has little prickers on it, and this nut is poisonous. It's illegal to do this now, but pioneers Native Americans used to beat these on rocks. It releases an alkaloid into the water, paralyzes the fish. They go through and pick up the fish, and then just by cooking the fish, this alkaloid is easily broke down by heat, so it becomes non-toxic to actually eat it. A nice palmate leaf. This is pretty typical of it. The tree itself, the wood's very soft. You've heard of Ohio being referred to as the Buckeye State. Well, how did we get that name? Well, obviously there's a lot of Buckeyes here to start with, but the people that moved in Ohio, when they first built their first homes, these were log houses, okay, or log cabins. So there's a difference between a log house and a log cabin. So the first home you would build would be a log cabin. That was a temporary structure. It was never meant to live in for a long time. So they would cut Ohio buckeyes because they were soft, easily worked, and they could quickly get at least some shelter up over top their heads. Then that first winter when they were living there, you'd make things like rope, and you'd start to get materials together for concrete. Since glass was so expensive, you usually didn't use glass unless you had money. And so you usually got some nice hides, you smoked them, so you'd have animal hides in the windows. And you got all this ready so when you actually started to build your log home that you were going to live in, it had the bark was off so the insects wouldn't start eating underneath the bark. You made sure that you had shakes or shingles on the top. Nails were very uncommon, so you actually had to tie those on. So the rope you were making during the winter was to tie every one of those shingles on to the top of the house. So buckeyes, eventually, when we got to the point right before the First World War, the buckeye took on a different significance. It became the favorite tree to make amputee limbs from. So buckeye was the leading manufacturer at one time in the world of making limbs for amputees. Now, with plastics and metal, that's not needed anymore. But this is our Ohio buckeye. Well, we're over here by the campus meeting house, and this nice little specimen, for all y'all down south, y'all recognize this. This is the southern magnolia or bull bay magnolia. And this is really out of place. This is the most northern southern magnolia I know of. Don't yell at me if I'm wrong. Cincinnati's had southern magnolias planted in sheltered areas. This one looks like it's got a little extra leaf loss to it, but it looks for the most part like it's hanging in there and doing really well. This is one of my favorite trees, I'll tell you what. I love this. First thing, it's evergreen, and it's nice big leaves. Most evergreens have really small little leaves, and you don't get much texture and interest out of them. This has these big bold leaves. Look at the backside. Look at that. It's kind of like brown felt, and it's just so cool to see them laying on the ground, you know, when they shed the leaves. The flowers are these nice, big, huge, fragrant flowers. If you've never stuck your nose in a bull bay magnolia, you got to get yourself down south, and you got to have some fun in your life before you die. But we can see right here's the seed pods. And if you look at these, magnolias are actually a pretty primitive tree. I'm going to show you a tree that's more primitive than this. But if you kind of look at this and you kind of think evolution, you kind of see where this is kind of not quite a pine cone. It's just starting to evolve from being a pine cone. These pop out, and there's a little thread that holds a red berry on the end of that thread. All magnolias do that. And it's amazing. The birds love them. They eat them. But I'm hoping this makes it. I really do. We're kind of in a nice sheltered spot. and I'm really hoping that this makes it, and this is a real specimen tree here in a few years. So this is our bulbae magnolia, a very unusual specimen for this far north. Well, we're stopped here in front of the theater, and for those of you who don't know what this beautiful little tree is, this is a katsura. It's not native to this country. But my plant guide, Michael Durr, if you're looking for a great book, Michael Durr's Woody Plants is a fabulous source of information. Tells you all about cultivating. If you even want to try to start things from cutting or seeds, he tells you how to do it. Michael Durr refers to this tree as probably the finest tree to grow in the Midwest. There's a couple different forms. This is the more upright growing form. Sometimes they grow where they're kind of more shrubby. They kind of grow all out. They kind of hover around. But this has got these gorgeous heart-shaped leaves. Fruits are not very, I mean, they're minimal. You don't have to worry about them. And the fall color is what really makes this. This is the most gorgeous yellow color you could possibly imagine when this flowers. So this is another one of my favorite trees. Don't tell anybody. Well, for those of you that are old enough to remember, we're standing in what used to be the sculpture garden. For those of you that aren't old enough to remember it, it's kind of an interesting place. And in the middle of the sculpture garden, we have this fabulous tree I want to talk about next. This is the ginkgo. So this is our ginkgo. And there's several of them on campus. Ginkgos seem to have one of these things. You either love them or you hate them. It's a love-hate relationship, which seems kind of weird that we have them at a Quaker college, but we do. This is a very old tree. This tree, not this particular one, but there was ginkgos alive during the dinosaur age. We have another dinosaur living fossil up on the other side of Denver called Metasequoia dawn redwood. And we have some excellent examples back in the Hazard Arboretum of metasequoias. But I want to talk about the ginkgo because it also holds a very interesting history. It's the last survivor of the ginkgo. It's a ginkgo biloba. If you look at the leaves, it kind of splits and has two lobes to it. This is what we call a dioecious tree, meaning two houses in Latin, meaning there's a male and female tree. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have a male tree, you usually love ginkgos. If you're unfortunate and have a female tree and a male tree close enough by, you usually hate ginkgos. The female tree produces a fruit about yay big, has a fleshy outer coating on it. When it ripens, it secretes butyric acid. So some people say it smells like vomit, it smells like dead carcasses, and inside of that little fleshy part looks like a nut almost. Kind of reminds me of a pistachio in some ways. You crack that, and they actually regard that as a nice food source. So they'll make soups out of them. They'll use them in meals over in Asia to this day. The symbol for Tokyo, Japan, is a green fan. And it's actually not a fan, it's a stylized ginkgo leaf. Ginkgos have been long used as trees in temple courtyards throughout China and Japan. But the China connection pales to the Japanese connection. When Hiroshima was bombed by the nuclear bomb that August, 6 ginkgos survived the actual blast. They were charred, branches broken off, and no one expected them to live. Those 6 trees to this day in Hiroshima are still alive, and they're actually growing. This is a testament. This is a powerful commitment for our Quaker heritage, that here's something that actually brothers of this survived the nuclear blast and actually are growing and actually still make it today. So this is our ginkgo, a really neat tree. The other thing that's really cool about ginkgos with fall coming up, they have this unique characteristic. The leaves get bright yellow. I remember sitting underneath this very tree when I was a student, and the funny thing is, once the first leaf falls, within about half a day, all the leaves are off the tree. It's like sitting in a golden rain shower of leaves. I gave up trying to study because I was constantly just sweeping leaves off my notes in my book. So, but yeah, gorgeous tree, great for city environments, adapts well. And this tree, there's specimens in the world in China that are 2,500 years old. So it is also one of the longest lived trees in the world. Well, we're surrounded in a small little grove of sweetgum trees. And sweetgum are kind of neat because they're easily identified, kind of a star-shaped leaf. And they have these woody little cluster balls or capsules or whatever we want to call them. But they're also, this tree is also native to Clinton County down in Villers Chapel, which is a protected area. It's a small wetlands that was not covered by the Wisconsin glaciation. And so it's from the previous glaciation, the Illinoisan glaciation. And these will live in some wet soils. For those of you from Maryland, Virginia, these are extremely common. Dime a dozen, you'll see sweetgum all over the place. But the real reason I stopped here is I want to take just a moment to talk about something that we take for granted and we don't even think of. As much as we oftentimes don't see the trees through the buildings, we don't think in terms of the wildlife. No, I'm not talking the ones in the dorm. I'm talking the wildlife that inhabits campus. So it's easy for us to not see the birds that are in the trees, especially migrating. We have deer back in the practice field, back in the arboretum. There's a family of foxes that raise a number of baby foxes, kits, every year successfully back by the baseball field. They roam through the woods back there and over the practice fields in the arboretum. But here's where it gets really interesting. I want to show you this series of holes. So here's an example of an animal that lives on campus we probably don't even see for the most part. This is the calling card of the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And as you look up this sweetgum tree, you'll see rows of these pecked lines. And that is what a yellow-bellied sapsucker does. Yes, Virginia, yellow-bellied sapsuckers are real. And it's a member of the woodpecker family, but it's a kind of unique member of the woodpecker family. It's a small bird, about the size of a downy woodpecker, if you're familiar with that. But where other woodpeckers are actively looking for insects in the tree or under the bark, the yellow-bellied sapsucker seems to intentionally drill this line of holes, and then it comes back. And hopefully the sap or insects are attracted to this damage, and then they feed off those insects that show up or get trapped in the resin. So that's the yellow-bellied sapsucker. The interesting thing is we have other woodpeckers. In fact, a lot bigger woodpeckers. We actually have a woodpecker that shows up on campus from time to time that's the size of a crow. It's called the pileated woodpecker. And when you see the hole this makes, it literally knocks a hole out in the tree that big. And when it starts thumping on a tree, you instantly know that's a pileated woodpecker. They're gorgeous, and their call is a little shrill kind of back in the woods. So it's very easy to tell when there's one back working in the woods. We don't think of our forest on campus as being a migratory stopover for birds. We see warblers, we see cardinals, we see a lot of different species of animals. But one that we don't think about as using us as a migratory stopover is monarch butterflies. So particularly this time of year, I like to watch the white pines on campus. And sometimes you will see 200, 300 monarchs roosting in the trees, resting on that migratory. You walk up to the tree and a lot of the monarchs will actually take off in the tree, and it's like having living leaves swirling around you. It's a very cool sensation. So think about the animals on campus next time you're walking around. Well, we're here in front of Pyle Center right now, and this is another one of my favorite trees. This is the lacebark elm, and this tree is so adaptable. This is the only tree we have on campus that we can say grows on every continent in the world except Antarctica. A little cold for it there. This is a fabulous tree. We're going to show you the bark a little bit up close, but it's got this gorgeous bark. It actually stands up to storms pretty well, and this is a native of China and Asia, where it actually gets fairly large, and they actually use it for lumber, for building furniture and barrel staves and things like that, because the wood is very tough. The other interesting thing about this is you'll see the little seeds on this. And what's unique about this is just finished blooming. Now, it doesn't have petaled flowers on it, so it's really not a bloom that calls out. But this is one of our very last trees to flower every year. And you can see the seed set on it. Looks pretty good this year. So once again, another one of my favorite trees, lacebark elm, and it's well worth growing in your yard. It's a fabulous tree. We're standing here by Austin Pickett dorms, and this tree happens to be a memorial tree to Jennifer Evans. And this is the rarest native Ohio tree we have growing on campus. This is called a yellowwood, a cladastrius. And this tree, even when you find it, more in Tennessee and Kentucky, where it's a little happier growing, it grows in small patches. This is not a common tree any place it grows. If you cut this branch, it gets its name for a couple of reasons. It has yellow heartwood, very bright yellow heartwood. One of the uses I found for this tree was that they would sometimes make gun stocks out of them because it had that yellow coloration. The second thing is they used to sometimes cut these trees down, and if you take the bark off the root system, you can boil it and it makes a wonderful yellow dye. So it used to be one of the sources for yellow dye. This is actually a member of the pea family. So peas, beans, red buds, locusts, all these. And it has a little dried seed pod on it that looks a lot like a bean pod or a pea pod. The seeds are small. But we don't think of beans, members of the bean family, we eat as being these big, huge trees. This tree will get bigger. And the other cool thing about it is, most of the time when you have a compound leaf, these leaflets are across from one another. But see how these are zigzag? These are all. This is the only tree I know that does this. So when you see this in the forest and you see this nice gray bark, if you happen to catch it when it's flowering, if you know what wisteria looks like, instead of having big clusters of purple flowers, they're white. There is a cultivar out that is pink, that has a pale pink color. But imagine this tree in big white clusters of hanging flowers, and they are fragrant at the same time. Again, another one of my favorite trees because the fall coloration is so great on it too. So this is our American yellowwood. Well, the Miracle Digital, we're actually back in the Hazard Arboretum. So we're off campus just for one stop. This is pawpaw, and this produces the largest fruit native to North America. This is native to Ohio. It's common throughout the state of Ohio. It's nothing exotic about it. But this is one of my favorite trees, by the way. I love the big leaves. And winter, the twigs are kind of small. And the fruit is really unusual on this. We'll show you the fruit here in a second. But what the connection to the college with this tree is this. Somehow, I don't know if someone found a small pawpaw, brought it into the Arboretum and planted it, if it was a cross that occurred out in the wild, if it was a cross that occurred here within the Arboretum. But there's a group of pawpaw enthusiasts that came in and saw this particular tree. And they were so impressed by it, impressed by the taste. It got high marks. It still gets high marks when they have pawpaw festivals. And in a nod to the college, they named it Quaker Delight. So this tree was actually discovered right here, Wilmington College, in the Arboretum. And that's our tree that actually has our college connection. The college has played host to one of the chapters of the American Pawpaw Society. And not only do we have these growing, but if you go out to the farm, there's several other varieties that are also growing. The pawpaws, the fruit, are about as big as you saw in the close-up shot. The inside's yellow. It tastes somewhere between banana and custard, and depending on the variety, any place between that. And the hard part is actually getting them, because raccoons like them, foxes eat them, deer will nibble on them from time to time. So you got to be very vigilant to get a pawpaw off the tree. The other unusual thing about this tree that I find kind of fascinating is this tree flowers very early in the spring, the leaves aren't even out, and these 3-petaled purple flowers to dark maroon flowers show up. The best way for us to get the best crop out of our pawpaws, we throw real roadkill back in the bush back there, because these flowers are pollinated not by bees, but by carrion beetles and flies. So keep that in mind. Not everything's necessarily bee pollinated. So this is our pawpaw. This is our Quaker Delight. This is, well, I might as well say it, another one of my favorite trees. This is the European beech, but this is the tricolored beech. If you look carefully, it actually has 3 colors on the leaf. Some rose, some green, and a little bit of kind of ivory white color. Now, those of us that are horticulturalists, we generally think when we see trees like this was what we call a mutation or a sport. And the sport is a mutated branch that comes off a tree. It's cut off, it's grafted, or it's grown. For instance, apples today. Apples are not even pollinated and seed grown anymore. All the companies look for and the universities look for is that branch that's got bigger apples, or maybe apples that are sweeter, or apples that ripen at a different time than the rest of the tree. So those are sports, and sports are how a lot of horticultural things today are actually grown and found. This, however, is unusual because this is not a sport. This is actually a mutation that's so successful that if you go over to Germany, there's an entire forest of this. I'm not talking like 5 or 6 trees, an entire forest of it. If you know what the copper beech is, which has a dark kind of maroon leaf, the copper beech is also European beech, but that is another mutation that's so successful, there's a forest over in Germany that has nothing but copper beech growing in it. We have a couple of these on campus. They're slow growing, but I love the color. They're a great accent tree. Don't plant too many in your yard. One's sufficient because you'll have everybody drooling over one. 5 of them just become boring. But this is the tricolored beech. Well, here's our final tree for the day for our tour. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you'll stick through and listen to this one. This is a great tree, and this has a history that ties into the college in a number of ways. So let's talk about the gentleman that found this tree first. The gentleman's name was John Bartram, 3rd generation Quaker, born outside of Philadelphia. At the time, his house was 3 miles from the center of Philadelphia. Today, it is Philadelphia. His gardens still exist to this day. They are slowly putting them back together. They also have done some archaeology work in them to determine where beds were and trees formerly sat. His gardens were not so much what we think of today as gardens for horticulture. They were gardens as botanical collection gardens. 2 plants that we have on campus that John Bartram introduced into the horticultural trade in North America is, first, the ginkgo tree. And we've already seen the ginkgo tree, we've already talked about the ginkgo tree. But John Bartram grew the very first 3 ginkgo trees ever planted in North America. One of those trees survives to this day in Bartram's garden in Philadelphia. The other plant is the oak leaf hydrangea, which has become extremely popular in the nursery trade in the last few years. If you actually want to see a live one, they are in front of the theater and also in front of Watson Library. John Bartram was a true pioneer, scientific pioneer. One reason this tree is here is to honor that Quaker legacy of John Bartram. John Bartram was the first American botanist. Linnaeus, who came up with the binomial scientific naming system that we use today, where you have the genus, so like for instance you have like oaks or quercus, and then depending on the oak you use the species. So remember the Shumard oak we looked at, the very first tree, that's Quercus Shumardia. So we see Bartram becomes a very early advocate of the Linnaean naming system. He collects specimens, he sends them to Sweden for Linnaeus to actually identify and put names to. And Linnaeus refers to Bartram as the finest botanist in the world for his age. But Bartram is more than just a botanist. Bartram had an interest in the animals, the geology, the topography, the soils, the insects, everything that made that environment work for those plants, where he collected those plants. And he was a traveling adventurer. Now, I'm sure a huge part of his being able to travel so much was with him being Quaker. You know, the Native Americans were sympathetic to the Quakers and didn't bother the Quakers because they knew that they weren't armed. They weren't going to cheat them out of anything. So Bartram, think around the American Revolution, he's traveling to Florida from Philadelphia. He's traveling to Georgia, to Alabama. He's going up to Lake Ontario, New England. He even manages to make it to parts of the Ohio River. And he's looking for plants. That's his primary mission. Well, when he is out exploring, his son is with him. His son's name's also John Bartram. And the poor kids and his wife at home are taking care of the gardens. And he creates a scientific society for expansion of science in Philadelphia with his good friend Benjamin Franklin. So the time that Bartram's living in is two revolutions that are going on. So Bartram dies in 1777, right shortly around the American Revolution. So not only is Bartram in Philadelphia area, and he's surely with his connections in science, Benjamin Franklin and other individuals, he has seen at least what's going on with the American Revolution. He's seen those ideas begin to form and begin. But at the same time, Bartram is involved in a whole nother revolution, the revolution involving Linnaeus. Now, Linnaeus was an interesting guy. Just to show you, Linnaeus had a sense of humor. Linnaeus named a genus of noxious weeds in Europe after one of his detractors, who said that the binomial naming system was not a good idea, and actually got in arguments and wrote papers saying that Linnaeus was a fraud. So Linnaeus did have a sense of humor about this. So here's John Bartram. He's down collecting, and he's in southeast Georgia. And he sees this tree flowering, and this gorgeous white flower with this huge ring of yellow stamens on the inside. And he's blown away by this plant. So he collects one, and he carries it back to him. He plants it in his garden, and it grows. And part of Bartram's patronage, not only did Benjamin Franklin convince King George III of England to make him the royal botanist, or the crown botanist in the colonies, so Bartram got 50 pounds a year for being the royal botanist for the crown. But he also, as he collected things and grew things in his garden, he would box those seeds and bulbs up and send them to people that supported him back in Europe, that would send him money to support his expeditions. So Bartram starts raving about this tree that he's found in southeast Georgia. And everybody wants this. Everybody thinks that this tree is just fabulous. So Bartram goes back to collect some more trees, or try to collect some seed. And what does Bartram find? Nothing. It's gone. This tree literally vanished from the wild. Now, today, every so often, somebody goes back to this area along the Altamaha River in Georgia and looks to see maybe if, there's some seeds that have finally germinated or something. And no one has ever found this tree growing in the wild since John Bartram collected that specimen. So every one of these trees today, any place in the world, goes back to John Bartram's garden. This is the descendant of the tree that John Bartram grew in his garden in Philadelphia. So that's our one connection. Bartram being Quaker, Bartram having this love of science. I can't think of a better building to put it next to. Right next to our very own science building. And, I hope the spirit of Bartram rubs off on our students, and they're just as passionate about their science as Bartram was. Bartram dies in 1777, and when he dies, his son takes over. His son takes over the garden. His son does keep continuing to do some exploration. When his son dies, his daughter takes it over. Today, the gardens are being restored, like I said earlier. And, oh, the other connection this tree has, anyone want to take a guess what the name of this tree is? This is named after his good friend. In fact, Bartram never named this tree. After Bartram's death in 1777, his son writes Linnaeus in Sweden and says, as a personal favor, would you name this tree after my dad's best friend? So the tree's name, one of our founding fathers. Okay, second guess, the name of the college before Wilmington. You get it yet? Yeah, this is Franklinia. So this is Franklinia Altamahea. And this is the lost tree of John Bartram. So thanks so much. I hope you've enjoyed our tour. Hope you've got a chance to hear a little bit of history, see some unique trees that are on campus. We have more. Feel free to come and stop and browse around. And next year we'll be back in the Arboretum with another exciting tour. Thank you so much.